Welcome to another episode of the Sportside podcast, and we're really lucky to be joined with Gary Stannett, MBE, who is an honorary fellow of London South Bank University, current CEO of the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, and previously worked with organisations such as Active Communities, Positive Futures, and his latest venture with Tactic Connect. Gary has affected communities around the world, bringing them together through sport, and he has changed the lives of countless people. I can't think to imagine. But first up, you are a football man. Tell me what you thought about that Alisson header on the weekend.
The Alisson header at the weekend was a bit outstanding, wasn't it? But as a Chelsea fan, I was still suffering from the FA Cup final, so it didn't quite register as much as it should.
So will you tell me about VAR then, if you're a Chelsea fan?
I don't think I'm allowed to say exactly what I think about it on here. VAR, I could see the reasons they brought it in, but I think it kind of takes a little bit of the soul out of football, to be honest. That immediacy of celebration, and I think probably most football fans that are in the stadium feel the same way. You almost can't celebrate anymore until you've waited 5 minutes for VAR. I think it kind of... I don't think it quite does what it says on the tin, let's put it that way.
Yeah, so he wasn't offside then?
No, I don't think it was, but I would say that, wouldn't I? But just as a caveat, Flo, to be honest, we didn't play well, and if you don't turn up, you can't expect to win. So no excuses on that. But the VAR thing is, we could probably spend a whole podcast talking about VAR and comparing it to how it works in rugby, right?
Yeah, well, to be honest, in rugby, there's a lot more sneaky stuff going on, so I think we need it. But I guess in football, it's slightly more clear-cut, and then when you bring technology into it, I think something that seems quite clear-cut becomes not so clear-cut.
No. Whether or not the players have cut their toenails or fingernails seems to be the issue. So that's one of the things. But anyway, that's another story for another day, I guess.
I did love that Alisson header though. Like of all the drama, for him to come up and just bosh it, and it was a pretty decent header as well. I just can't imagine how many young goalkeepers are out there now practicing their headers for that one moment.
And the amount of times that you see goalkeepers push forward and they just look like a fish out of water. So, it was brilliant. And it was drama, which is what you want in sport, right? So, and it's going to keep it lively for the next couple of games in the Premier League as well. So, should be interesting times.
Fans coming back this week, I think, as well. So that will add to the occasion of everything, which I can't wait just to see live sport again and people going to stadiums. Be unreal.
I think we're all looking at that. I can't wait to actually be able to get back out there. I mean, we're starting to get back into coaching and getting your sort of young people and teams back underway. The next step is sooner we can get in the stadiums, because I think while all of the live sport that we've had through the lockdown has been a great distraction, I think anyone who watches it and goes regularly, you know that the atmosphere is different. You know, it must be weird for the players as well, playing on those empty pitches and not having that support and that intensity around them.
I can't imagine to think how many games would have gone the other way had they had home support. But it'll be
home advantage is a big thing, isn't it? It gets taken out of the mix quite badly.
Right, let's crack on with what we're meant to be talking about rather than just football chat. So through your ventures, you've continually managed to break into communities across the world and engage with a massively eclectic mix of people. What do you think is so unique about sport that has allowed this kind of engagement across so many cultures?
Okay, I think sport, to be honest, it's probably the best way of putting it. You've hit the nail on the head there. You've used the word culture. I think sport is a global culture. I think it's one of those things that is accessible to people no matter what their background is. It's accessible to people no matter where they are in the world. It's a great way to communicate and to work together without actually having to say too much. I think it's a thing that you can use. It's culturally familiar to people. So you can take it into an environment where there could be some serious issues, but there will be a commonality around sport, whatever it may be. So from that perspective, I always use the example that, I could probably put, 4 kids in a room that don't speak the same language. But if I put a football in between them, they'll work out what to do with it. And if they don't know what to do with it, they'll find something to do with it, because it does have that sort of universal language. And if you harness that in the right way, I think it can make a serious impact on young people and communities around the world. I think the other thing around sport, of course, is, and it does depend on the sport, obviously this probably wouldn't apply to yachting or anything that requires a great deal of equipment, but actually sport is also something that, you can make use of a park or a play area or a piece of waste ground. If you have a ball, you can make up a game and you can play. So it isn't dependent always on money and finances and resources. It's something that is quite accessible at an entry level. So yeah, for me, I just think sport, because of its accessibility, the unique place it has in global culture, and the fact that people, regardless of background, have a passion for it, makes it quite unique in the work that we do, but also just unique in the world of sort of bringing people together and community development.
Yeah, definitely. Sport is definitely a language that no matter where you're from, I think everyone can kind of speak, and it's almost like human nature to be competitive and to get out and be active, regardless of where you're from. It's not mutually exclusive to one culture. There's hundreds of ways and inlets into sport, and I think the programs that you've built have showed that and demonstrated that you can sort of not necessarily copy and paste, but you can pick up a program with sport at the heart of it, and you can drop it anywhere in the world, and you'll be able to find people who will engage with it. So on that, and talking a little bit more globally now, having worked with like communities around the world from Africa to South America to Asia, and have you ever built different approaches according to that culture? And did you find anything that was surprising along that journey? So something worked really well in Asia that may not have worked well in Africa, for example.
Good question, and a few questions in there. I think in terms of the work that we do, Flo, to be honest, one of the things that I've sort of picked up as we've gone is actually the content of the work that we do is broadly very, very similar as it works, no matter where you are. So the approach that I've sort of embraced and throughout all of the various things that I've done, and we continue to embrace with the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, is very much around we take the sport into the communities. We don't expect people to travel to us. So it's not a case of we plot up at a stadium and everyone travels. We will go into neighbourhoods, we'll go into communities, and we'll use whatever facilities are there. We're there consistently, which means that the young people and their parents and the people around can see us as a regular part of the community infrastructure, rather than just something that parachutes in for a day or two and then disappears. We're very much around recruiting and supporting and training local people to lead. So it's about putting the community at the forefront, capacity building and putting local leadership in rather than, again, parachuting in. So a lot of the work that I've done globally has been less around us going out and delivering. It's been more about us going and capacity building and training and working with the local networks to put something together. So from that perspective, the approach has been sort of pretty similar and pretty successful, whether that's been in South Africa, Pakistan, London, wherever we've been. I think obviously within that you have some significant cultural factors that you have to take into account, and the local context as well is always there. So, you have to think about the community safety issue is definitely one. In some of the areas we've worked in, it's not feasible to do some of those programs maybe late into the evening, which you would do in the UK, for example. You might deliver on a Friday night. You've all seen the midnight football kind of concepts. There are parts of South Africa, parts of other parts of the world where you wouldn't necessarily do that, because either young people wouldn't be willing to come out, or their parents wouldn't be willing, or it's just not safe to do it. Ditto when we've worked in Pakistan. You have quite some significant issues there around the safety piece for young people. So there are those sort of cultural contexts about what you can do. There's the cultural piece, so for example, particularly, something you're quite passionate around, particularly around sort of girls and women's engagement in sport. You have to sort of work around some quite significant challenges around the perception of women in sport. You have to look at whether or not parents actually think it's acceptable for girls to play sport. If you do decide to do it, then you have to do that in a context of, you have to keep it away, do it in an enclosed space where people can't look in, with female coaches. But going back to the first piece, if you're working in poor communities where you're using outdoor facilities and local facilities rather than a sports centre where you can block it off. So there's always those sort of local cultural contexts that you have to deal with. There's all of the local sort of community context, but the core principles of delivering in the heart of a community, supporting people from the community to develop their skills as coaches and as youth workers, working with the young people to make sure that the program is a good fit, and then using that sport as a pathway for mentoring, training, education, aspiration, and trying to link it into pathways where young people can progress. that's been fairly consistent throughout. And you know, even when some of the programs we've delivered on have been around reducing gang violence, others have been around enhancing education and training. But no matter which way you've done it, the core principles have always sort of sat the same. So I think probably if there was a surprise over the years, it's that we didn't have to modify the approach massively. It was just how you use that approach in a local context that was the challenge.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to jump on that bit around the getting girls engaged and female athletes more. What are those bigger issues that I guess in the UK we're slightly naive to in slightly poorer communities, and that obviously female athletes have got a lot of barriers to participation already, but how do you get around the fact that there would be hugely non-progressive perceptions towards female athletes going out and even just having a kick around, let alone thinking about sport could be a career? But how do you get around that, and how do you get around changing those perceptions in different communities and cultures where it's going to be less in the forefront of the media?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge. And if you're not there sort of long term, and some of the work that we've done has been quite short term in terms of training and capacity building, you know, it's in some of the stuff we're looking at is you're talking about quite a long term cultural shift is what you're looking at. So, you know, we've been doing some work recently, or I've been doing some work over a couple of years in the Caribbean around sort of football development, and depending on where you are in that sort of neighborhood, you know, and it kind of is through CONCACAF, so you go into Central America as well. How would I put it? There are some quite traditional and conservative stances on what is male activity, what is female activity. There are some serious issues around, you know, what does that actually mean if a girl is playing sport? You know, there's sort of questions and inferences around sexuality and who they are as a person and what they are as a person. So you have a lot of that sort of cultural question mark, that sort of traditional mindset that is, you know, sport isn't really for girls. You've also got to think as well, I guess, you know, there's also some practical concerns, you know, here in the UK or in Europe, I guess, and America and other parts of the world as well. We're quite well sort of forward in terms of our safeguarding policies, procedures, our checks on coaches, their backgrounds, how people work. You know, there is also that question mark that if you're in a part of the world where, you know, the idea of having a DBS check to see whether you're suitable to work with young people, whether there's proper safeguarding sort of regulations around sort of health and safety, risk assessment, recordings, all of that kind of stuff isn't there. So there is also a real issue, and sort of, you know, to their credit, a huge amount of the global sports organisations have recognised that, and they've started looking at child protection and safeguarding in its biggest sense. But there is also an element of that around girls and young women that parents wouldn't be necessarily happy for their daughters to go to a coaching environment where they don't know the coaches, they don't know whether they're going to be looked after. So again, there's that sort of context around perception and traditional values, but there's also some quite practical safety issues that you need to think about as well. Even in sort of in the world that we work in around safeguarding and child protection, we've seen all of the stuff that's happened in football in the UK. We've seen what's happened in US gymnastics and what's come out there. So even in countries where we are aware and we've got we should have those safeguarding procedures in place, and we consider ourselves to be that much more forward around protection of athletes generally, young people generally, girls in particular, you know, we still have those issues. So you can imagine taking that to an environment where that isn't the norm. It poses a whole heap of challenges to get over. I guess there's also a big question as well about whether or not, you know, national governing bodies and sports organisations have got a big role to play in that. And it's how much time, how much effort and how much place they put in to the girls and women's agenda as well. But for all of that, we've seen some really good stuff as well. You know, it's not all doom and gloom. You know, there are ways around it. I think investing in female coaches, investing in awareness around female sport, around making sure that when girls and young women do turn up to play, they've got the same sort of facilities, the same investment, they're taken as seriously as when you run a boys tournament or otherwise. And we're seeing that now. More and more national governing bodies, clubs are trying to do that. And I think if you keep investing in that, you do start to change some of that narrative and change some of those perceptions. But I don't think there's an overnight fix. I think it's going to be quite a long journey. And in places where resources are limited, it probably poses more challenges.
Definitely. And yeah, I totally agree. It's not, we're in a much better place than we were, say, 20 odd years ago. Even in the UK, there's been massive shifts, and hopefully that can lead the way in terms of those perceptions. But it is a difficult one, because it's sort of like, is it down to a national governing body to get policies in place, or is it down to a shift in cultural perceptions so it doesn't even become a thought? Because at the end of the day, you can put as many rules and policy in place as you want, but if they're only there to protect people because these thoughts or these ideas are still happening like negatively towards women, I think that's the real issue. It's like culturally, I think the media and personalities within the sport potentially need to do more to shift those perceptions, so that we don't have to have policies to say look after women or value women, because I think it should go without, in the next 10 years or so, like that should go, well, hopefully now, but it should go without saying look after women, respect young female athletes, and to have a policy in place to do what I would believe is human nature is a difficult one to understand. I think culturally the shift needs to happen from there. I don't think it's necessarily down to governing bodies to create policy, because you shouldn't need to tell someone to be kind.
But I think the national governing bodies and clubs do have a big part to play in that, though, Flo, because I think that, if national governing bodies and, there's probably loads of examples. The one that sticks in my mind is, a couple of years ago, the Irish women's international football team, there was a big furore because they were still getting hand-me-down kit. They were having to pay their own gym fees. They weren't getting expenses. So if the national governing bodies and the clubs don't sort of say that actually the female games, female sports are as much of a priority as the men's, then obviously that leads into a culture that somehow it's a second class activity, second class priority, and going into kind of the professional sporting game a second class product, which means that then the media don't pick up on it, so it's not as exposed, so people don't buy into it, and it becomes kind of a circle, doesn't it? I think that I think the even something as basic as just saying, look, if you're representing your country, there's an equal level of pay. You're not getting
you say that's basic. I think there's very few female international athletes who are on equal pay. But yeah, you would think it's a good starting point.
It's a basic starting point, isn't it? Actually, let's just recognise that if you're an international athlete, you're an international athlete. There's your starting point. Automatically, that's a change in perception. But as you say, I don't think it's that widespread. And I don't think it's happening that much at all.
It's not. And yeah, I totally agree that national governing bodies have got a big opportunity to pave the way and say, put a marker out and say, look, we're valuing them the same, so you guys should too. But I think sometimes sport, I know sport is a business and you've got to think about where the money's coming in. But if you don't invest in the team in the first place, how can you expect money to come in? And you've got international teams out there who are not only not being paid but having to pay to play their sport, female athletes, and it's just baffles me. It should be an honor to represent your jersey, not how much money have you got in your bank, and then you can do it. It's crazy.
And then you sort of drill that down a little bit, coming back to the stuff that we've been talking around, is what message does that send out to girls and young women around sport and what part it should play in their life if it's not valued in that way? It's sort of that, it's almost, it keeps that stereotype going. So parents don't think that it's necessarily a particularly female thing to do. Girls may think, get sort of disillusioned and step away from the game. I mean, I'm sure you must know loads of people in your journey that have probably been into sport but stepped away from it at various points for a number of reasons. It's a sort of it's that interpretation, isn't it? And I mean, we're probably going off on another one now, but I do think that national governing bodies and clubs and the professional side of the game need to invest a little bit more, and that changes perception. And if you go to somewhere like, I don't know, let's say we talked about the Caribbean, if the message coming out from government, sports departments, the national, the Football Association, CONCACAF, that actually this is a very valued and integral part of our sporting policy. We are going to invest as much into girls and young women's development as we are into men's development. We are going to, really sort of invest in female coaches who've got a task to go and recruit. You do start to change some of those cultural pieces because the perception of sport is slightly different. So, yeah, there's my closing comments. Do the national governing bodies have a role? Yeah, I think they do.
Yeah, and it is definitely a top-down approach because national governing bodies can do their bit, but then the programs that you're a part of and being out there on the ground is also a massive part of widening that funnel at the bottom as well, because you can't just inspire that elite level sport, you've got to inspire the gateway as well. And having, like you say, female coaches around and coaches from different backgrounds just creates those role models immediately on the front line that young people from around the world can hopefully relate to in a number of different ways and get them hooked in their first initial journey of sport. And like you say, sport it transcends culture and language and socioeconomic status. So the more people you can get involved at the ground level, the better it will feed up into the top.
And it's about investing in those sort of coaches. So in this case, we're talking about female coaches, but it's about investing people locally and making sure they're visible as role models, because it's that old thing, isn't it? If you can't see it, you can't be it. So,
there it is. Yeah.
So we need to kind of invest in that, and that's very much the approach that we've taken. Invest in the communities, invest in the local infrastructure, invest in the local coaches, because they're going to be there long after we've moved on, and it's not about sort of bringing a new type of sporting colonialism. It's about sharing experiences, investing in the people, and then give the people the tools and the resources to be able to move on.
Yeah, it's all about that longevity, and it's great to have platforms such as Sportside out there. So once people are hooked in sport and they want to then, if they go somewhere new and they want to get involved in sport or a different club elsewhere around the country, then having something like Sportside where they can just log in and go, right, I want to play football this Friday, what's happening, or tennis or whatever it may be, it allows people to continue with that journey of sport. So a little bit more about what you're doing with the Rio Ferdinand Foundation. What would you take from your previous projects around the world and to implement them into the current programs, and what differs working with a foundation such as the Rio Ferdinand Foundation compared to what you've done before?
Okay, again, interesting stuff. So Rio Ferdinand Foundation, I mean, I've been quite fortunate that I've been around the Rio Ferdinand Foundation throughout its 10 years in a variety of advisory roles and sort of supporting the growth of the organisation. So I think, in a way, some of the work that we've done over the years has been shaped quite a lot by my experiences and my input. So from that, we kind of mirror a lot of the work that the methodology, I guess, that I've talked about, which is we're very much around working within the community, taking the programs out there. We're very much around capacity building local people to be coaches and youth workers and mentors. And that's the key thing for us. We don't necessarily look at sport. We're not about a sport for excellence program. We're not even really just about participation and club development. For us, sport is a pathway to support young people to overcome challenges in their lives and to reach their potential. So we sort of we've taken all of that methodology on, so young people can get involved in positive activities where they live. They get support from coaches and access to personal and social education programs and health programs, which is all around sort of their resilience, communication skills, teamwork, aspiration. We deliver accredited training pathways and sort of vocational skills, and then we work with young people to put on projects that are in the heart of their own community, so that there's that whole youth leadership piece around it. And then more formally, we work with a range of employers and companies to sort of offer transition routes for young people into further education, training and employment. So it's a bit of a pathway that sport is a part of in terms of it's the journey. And we see our coaches as being, I always think coaches have got quite a unique place in young people's lives anyway, because I think that if you look at most of the adults that young people engage with, parents, teachers, social workers, police officers, whatever, there's a degree of authority there that's given to them by society and the law. I think coaches have a degree of authority and influence in young people's lives because the young people give it to them. They don't have to be there. They can walk off. So I think that it's a slightly different relationship. And if you can harness that influence so that it's not just around playing the sport, but it's also around positivity. It's around challenges. It's about thinking about your career. It's about thinking about your aspirations. So bringing a lot of youth work kind of skills into the coaching environment can make a huge difference. So I guess from my previous experience, it's kind of formed some of the approach of the Rio Ferdinand Foundation over the years. And some of the stuff that we've done with Rio Ferdinand Foundation has probably informed some of the work we've done elsewhere. More formally, I've been CEO of the Rio Ferdinand Foundation on a part-time basis for the last couple of years. And I think the difference that kind of comes with someone like Rio and the Rio Ferdinand Foundation is, I think, on the one hand, having somebody like Rio as your advocate, your ambassador as the lead, I think it kind of adds an extra layer of attraction for young people and organizations to want to get involved with you. I think it probably also adds a sort of a layer of kudos and credibility, especially when it's an athlete foundation that has been going for 10 years rather than sort of something new. So I think working with Rio and obviously the other ambassadors that we have from various sort of industries, it definitely opens up doors, pathways, and gives an added credibility when you first go in or you first start a dialogue with talking to people. I think after that, it is all around the quality of what we deliver. I don't think people necessarily just come in because they want to sort of say that they worked with Rio. I think there is about the quality of delivery. So I think that brings a huge amount of added value there. Working with the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, I think, for me, probably just gives you that extra amount of traction when you're trying to talk to policymakers, because obviously Rio is there. Rio talks about the anti-racism stuff. He talks about the mental health piece. So it's constantly being talked about on a national stage, which means that your access is maybe easy is probably the wrong word, but people will know that Rio is talking about it, so it's genuine and they want to engage with you. Whereas I think previously, if you're working on a grassroots program, you maybe have to take a couple of extra steps before people open their door and listen to what you do or what you want to say, which isn't right. But I guess it's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I guess it adds that sort of a slight degree of pressure because you've got a name that is well known talking about it. So you've got probably that increased audience. And when people are aware that these conversations are happening, they kind of expect change. So I could totally see how when those doors open slightly easier, that they're expected to action a few of those.
It does also have its own challenges as well, Flo, to be honest, in an interesting way, because there is also so from a Rio Ferdinand Foundation perspective, we've always been very, very clear that it's about what we do on the ground. So that's why we invest and we get evaluations around our work. We try and get sort of that external evidence base. So it's not sort of we're marking our own homework all the time. So it's very much about priding yourself on what you do on the ground, how you work with partner organizations, how you progress young people. I think, and all of the stuff we've said, if you've got that, and then all of the bonuses and the advantages of having somebody like Rio and having the name Rio Ferdinand Foundation is great. You also get the flip side. I think there's a lot of people out there that still think that athlete charities are vanity projects. It's about the public image. We get the sort of thing around, do they mean it? Or is it just sort of, the lip service that we're paying? There's always the big issue around, why should an ex-footballer's charity, take money and why should I give money to an ex-footballer's charity? Which is interesting because it never seems to apply to the Prince's Trust. And I always think the royal family might have a lot more money than any athlete I've ever seen. But anyways, so, you do have that sort of slightly strange negativity that comes with it as well, because it's kind of perceived that, footballers, athletes in general have got loads of money, and if they want to do it, they can do it themselves. And do they really mean it anyway, or is it just a vanity project? So there's sort of pros and cons, I guess, to working with an athlete charity. But from my perspective, I think the pros probably outweigh the cons in terms of that extra level of visibility to share our messaging.
Yeah, and I'm sure those people that want to just have a dig potentially on the target market anyway. So let them have this, Stu. Anyway, talking of using athletes for voices for change, with the Rio Ferdinand Foundation action all really being around youth-led, What do you think about the rise of footballers using their voice for positive change, including the likes of Rio, Marcus Rashford, etc.? Do you think this is positive that these athletes are coming out and actually having a standpoint, or do you think it's not their responsibility and it's unfortunate that they've been put in those positions where they feel they need to and it should be led more by the clubs?
Yeah, good question. There's probably sort of two questions in one there. In terms of the athletes, I don't think is necessarily a responsibility. I will say that. I think that we wouldn't necessarily say that that a musician has a responsibility to put something back and become an advocate. I think that to say that, certainly in terms of when it comes to establishing foundations and being very, very active around an issue, I think there's, Marcus, and it's really about whether or not they mean it. This is the key, isn't it? Do you mean it? Is it something you really believe in? If it's something you really believe in, then you have got a platform to talk and influence and raise issues that probably very few other people on the planet have got. Marcus Rashford, clearly had a huge passion from his background and growing up in that whole poverty and hunger piece, and particularly food poverty. He has, and that was his thing, and he meant it. You can tell when you listen to him, he means it. He grew up with it. So he's put together an absolutely fantastic campaign that's forced, policy U-turns on 2-3 occasions at this stage within government, using that piece of work. But when you talk to him, you know that it's not a sort of, it's not lip service. He genuinely means it. So if you have that platform and you genuinely mean it, then I guess you have a responsibility to do something with it. Similarly with Rio. Rio's sort of whole thing was grew up in Peckham. The reason he set up his foundation is because he was getting fed up with young people constantly being seen through the lens of crime, violence, feral youth. His experience growing up is that young people in places like Peckham and Salford, because he did a lot of work up there when he was at United, there's a huge amount of potential there. These young people have got talent, they've got aspirations, they've got all of the same ambitions that any other young person would have, but what they don't have is the opportunity, the networks, the mentoring, the facilities, the resources. So we set out to do something around that and do something to change that, and I think we have. I think that it gets into dangerous space. I do think that footballers and athletes generally do have a responsibility about what they say and how they act and what they do, because like it or lump it, they do get looked up to by young people. But do they have a responsibility to be an activist around this stuff? I think that's down to personal choice and whether you mean it and whether you feel comfortable doing it. Rio's pretty articulate around what he wants to say. Marcus has been very much the same. Lawrence Dallaglio, going back into rugby and his rugby work stuff, again, very, very sort of articulate about what he wants to achieve with that piece of work. Doesn't necessarily sit well on everybody's shoulders. So, a responsibility to think about how they act and what they do. Yes, a responsibility to be a social activist and to kind of throw their weight behind in the same way as Marcus has, or Lawrence or Rio. I think probably that's down to personal choice would be my answer on that one. In terms of sporting bodies, I think that's a slightly different thing. I think there is a responsibility there. There's a responsibility there to challenge negative behaviours. There's a responsibility there to make change socially so that players aren't being abused on social media and on a pitch. There is a responsibility there to use their voice and their leverage to bring some positivity. But I do think, again, it's just worth flagging, because this is key. A lot of the issues that we're talking about, racism, equality, inclusion, they are society issues. They're not ring fenced to sport. It's not like, people turn up at a football match, become racist for 90 minutes and then go home and then they don't think about it again till the next match. There's a real society thing there that needs to happen. So sport has to play its part, but I don't think we should put a lot of the issues directly on, say that they're a problem in sport alone. It tends to be quite big across society. So I think national governing bodies and clubs have a part to play, but they're not the only part of the jigsaw.
Yeah, definitely. And clubs can support players where they feel uncomfortable with a situation, instead of having a player to have them go and put their neck out and say this isn't okay. I do think there is a responsibility of those clubs to look after the players if they are feeling uncomfortable with certain situations, because then not only have you got to think about your athletic career, but you've got to think about, oh, I need to say this or I need to stand up for that. And then suddenly what started as all I got to do is focus on a Saturday for 90 minutes or however long it is, you're suddenly dealing with a whole host of other issues as well. And I think that as much as the clubs can take that off players' shoulders alongside their sport, it's brilliant. And like you're saying with the athlete activism stuff, if it suits you and you want to talk about it, I think it's welcome for athletes to have a standpoint if they want to. And I'm hoping that people like Rio and Marcus have sort of opened the door for athletes who may well have wanted to do things before, but they think, oh, well, someone's just going to say, stay in your lane. What do you know about XYZ? You're only a footballer or you're only a rugby player or an athlete. But I do think athletes are very well placed, as you say, whether you like it or not, you are a role model. And if there's something that you care about genuinely and you want to make a change, athletes have got a lot more sway than even in politicians or actors or musicians in some cases, because that passion that you have, if someone plays for your team or plays for your country, you'll kind of follow them regardless of what they're saying. So there is an opportunity to make a change being an athlete and having an opinion on things that matter to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think clubs are an interesting one as well. I think clubs have a bigger role to play. That most of them, and I'll talk around football, but other clubs are the same. Most of them tend to be rooted in working class communities where there are social issues, where there are other things happening, and they're a part of that community. And I think more and more clubs, football and rugby, I know for two sports that I have worked with, are doing quite a lot in that field in terms of delivering holiday hunger programs, delivering educational programs, and what have you. And I think that's been quite a nice shift in the last sort of 10 years or so. I think clubs are far more now seeing themselves as part of a community. And realizing that they have a role in that community beyond the match day experience. I still think there's a long way to go, but again, I think that generally we're seeing sport recognizing that it has an influence and it has a part to play. But I would always just go back to it and say that all of the issues that we're discussing, we've talked about gender equality and sort of equal representation. We've talked around sort of the whole thing around poverty and food hunger and mental health. All of these aren't just restricted in the sporting environment. And I think one of the dangers we have is, whenever there's a racist incident with a football club, for example, it becomes football's problem. And you have to kind of look beyond that and say, actually, since through the whole Brexit process, we've seen some quite serious toxicity in terms of language around culture, ethnicity, gender, race. So we can't just always isolate it and say, well, that's football's issue, when damn well that if you go to the pub or you're in a taxi or you're on a train, you'll hear people expressing the same opinions. They just won't be doing it in a crowd of 30,000.
Yeah, it's not plastered all over Sky Sports for everyone to see, and then suddenly it's a football is a racist sport or XYZ is a racist club, and it's just the media attention that it gets. Everyone is quite convenient to sort of think, oh, this is a football problem, not a societal problem, and obviously it goes the other way, doesn't it? Like people are built in society, and then they choose to get involved with football, and it's that football doesn't turn you into, or sport doesn't turn you into anything that society already didn't ingrain within you. So
yeah, and it's an easy excuse, isn't it? I will lump that on the FA. The FA have got to deal with that. Really, well, first of all, are the FA best placed to deliver that? Because if you look at the board of the FA, it's not necessarily as representative as it should be. But secondly, why is it sports' problem? Why is it football's problem? What are you going to do about it as police, education, government, whatever it may be? But yeah, so I think just sort of without sort of going too much into that policy approach, I think clubs, national governing bodies definitely have a role to play, but let's sort of make sure that we recognise that that's in a context that society has to deal with these issues, not just sport.
Yeah, definitely. So working with the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, what would be like your key targets or your key issues that you would love to tackle in like the next 5 or so years?
Well, for us, it's actually we've actually just gone through that process, and we did it with we did it really by going and talking to the young people that we work with. So we've kind of used the period. We've just done a bit of a rebrand and a sort of a rejig on the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, because I think we said earlier, this year is our 10-year anniversary, so it's a decade. So we thought it was a good time to reflect on our sort of work and our successes over the previous years. But also there's a big thing for us that, we're coming out of COVID. It's a different time. It's a different kind of society we're working with. So we've done quite a deep dive with a lot of the young people that we work with in London, Manchester, in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, to look at the what they think they need. And we've effectively kind of identified 4 pillars of work that we have going forward. So the first one is around safe spaces, and safe spaces physically, safe spaces online, because we do quite a lot of digital and online work as well. And safe spaces for young people to be able to talk and express themselves, because, there's a big issue there. But I think as we're coming out of COVID, we've seen a real disruption in social networks. We've seen a real disruption in community links. And we're finding that there's quite a lot of anxiety in young people that are coming back, and having that sort of safe space where they feel that they can be themselves and they can express themselves and they're not going to be judged is key. So we have the Safe Spaces agenda, which is around sort of encouraging young people to participate and feel that they're going to be supported. The second pillar of the work is around physical and emotional health and well-being. So, again, we've come out of the COVID piece. Sport has been disrupted, but also a lot of young people, going back to it, anxiety issues around the future, around their health, mental health issues in young people are huge. You see the stats every day in mainstream media around the impact. So we deliver programs there that are very much around sort of getting young people to participate in positive activities, but we also do a lot of workshops and a lot of one-to-one support to increase young people's resilience, increase their confidence, work with them in groups to think about aspirations and where they want to go and what the key issues are that affect them in their lives and what kind of routes they can take to overcome that. And then we also, we're not clinical mental health specialists, so we have partnerships with organisations regionally and nationally who can offer that more specialist counselling and mental health support that we can refer young people onto. So the second piece of that really is where we work. The third pillar is around stronger, safer and more inclusive communities. So that's around really working with young people, upskilling them, bringing them sort of vocational skills, matching them with mentors, adults, people from other parts of the community, and working with them to deliver projects. So young people in the lead, young people get to deliver projects in the heart of their own community that reflect issues that they specifically feel affect them in their lives in a practical way. And then the fourth area of work is around that pathways to achieve, and that's the employability and education and training routes, meaningful careers we do. So all of those areas of work have been really sort of defined by the young people we work with. Big issues for us, I think, are about that rebuilding society, rebuilding communities, and how do we play our part in that piece of work? How do we enhance young people's skills, confidence and networks to help enhance their social mobility and their opportunity to achieve in life? And then how do we take all of that sort of knowledge base, that youth voice, that expertise, and use it to try and influence stakeholder and policy over the coming years when it relates to young people, working class communities and communities that are kind of excluded for whatever reason is broadly where we're looking to go. So very ambitious, and there's a lot to it, but those are the key issues that we're working on.
In short, just change the world, yeah? Something
like that. But bit by bit, from the street level up, that'd be good.
Yeah, And massively, I think too many times organisations just go in and they maybe pay lip service, do one big event at the top level, and there's like absolutely no longevity to it. And it's 100% what you're saying about building these foundations and the longevity of these programs and connecting communities, because once you get those connections going, the snowball effect will happen and it will build and build and build. And like you say, there's just so many transferable skills in sport, whether it's from a social aspect or a communication aspect, teamwork, and even like the physical and the mental aspect, like going out and having a kick about with your mates, you'll get a buzz off it. Whether you're kicking in top bins on a goalpost that are 2 jumpers on the field, or you're actually thinking, you know what, this could be a career, that buzz is still the same. And I think the more people you can connect with that, the better. And like having those communities that have an ability to get involved with that in an inclusive way is just brilliant. And
I think it's right. I was just going to jump on that. Sorry, Flo, just very quickly. And I think the other thing, just to add in there, is that we also recognise that the Rio Ferdinand Foundation, again, going back to my previous point around sports clubs, we're a part of the jigsaw. So there is about working in partnership and working with that local infrastructure. So that will include local football clubs. We're doing a lot with Peckham Town Football Club at the moment, for example, in South London. We've done stuff with Stalybridge Celtic, who are hosting work for us up in the northwest. We're working with local refugee sort of support groups for the Syrian community in Northern Ireland, because they've obviously got real close in there. We work with national organisations like UEFA. We work with businesses around how we can work with them so that their CSR initiatives can impact on young people. So there is a very, very strong interconnected jigsaw there. I think Rio Ferdinand Foundation offer a pathway, but we also don't believe that we are the answer to everything, because we can't be.
No, definitely not. But to facilitate a few of those answers is definitely a place to start. Can you tell us a little bit about the United Against Racism programme that was launched earlier this year, and what the goals you want to achieve with that are?
Yeah, absolutely. So just sort of taking it back a little bit, last year through COVID, we were part of a collective of youth organisations, sports organisations that came together called the Hope Collective. And it was all around basically marking the 20-year anniversary of the murder of Damilola Taylor, and campaigning for the 7th of December, which was Damilola's birthday, to become a UK Day of Hope. There was a whole heap of stuff that was going to happen. There was going to be the Hope 2020 campaign, and then COVID came around. So it was kind of condensed in the end. But we did a really, really fantastic online Youth Voices program, which kind of got young people from across the whole of the UK to submit programs on the theme of hope and what they wanted to see for their future. And we got some great stuff in there. There was environmental pieces there. There was the mental health. There was the racism. There was jobs. It was a really, really strong piece of work. So and we got our Day of Hope. So the 7th of December is the UK's Day of Hope in memory of Damilola now, which is fantastic. So coming into our 10-year anniversary and looking at the success, and a lot of young people were asking us about what happens next. After the Hope campaign, what happens next? So we thought, it's our 10-year anniversary. We have a model here that is around amplifying young people's voices. We went back and we spoke to some of the young people on our programs and said, what is it you really want to be looking at? And inequality and racism were two of the key issues that came up time and time again. We sort of spoke, we put together a working group with some of the young people we were with, and we looked at how we wanted to respond to those issues. And the thinking was that for a lot of those young people, those issues were relevant and they were part of their day-to-day lives. So, when you started talking around institutional racism, and we started talking around, structural inequality, and we started talking around the growing sort of the growing wealth gap between the richest and poorest in society, all of those things were things that young people related to, but maybe not in the way of how do we influence that policy change? How do we make a change at boardroom level? How do we government policy? It all seemed a little bit too far away. And a lot of the thinking was actually, what can we do about it in our own lives and in our own communities? So basically, we've come up with the idea of United Against Racism. It's very much around how do we work with all of the young people and communities we work in, white, black, Asian, refugee, Irish, English, whatever it may be, wherever we work. How do we get young people to come together to look at inequality and racism where they live and on the streets that they walk, and to support them to come up with social action projects that make a change in their everyday lives? So that practical change that can be done locally. So that's underway now, and we're getting some really, really good stuff that's starting to emerge, and increasingly we're getting people that want to work with us on that. And the plan is that we will deliver regional events that showcase this stuff in Belfast, Manchester, and London over the coming year. But it's all going to feed into a national United Against Racism activity on the 7th of December for this year's Day of Hope, which will all be around young people having their say on race, inequality, and how do you actually take practical steps to change things.
Yeah, it's all about that tangible change, isn't it? It's not just we're going to talk about it. It's like, hey, active, what can we do?
Basically, we
underground.
didn't want another campaign. This is no disrespect to Kick It Out or any of those, because obviously they've got a space to go. But did the world need another kind of campaign, or did the young people we were talking to, they wanted to do something about it? So for us, it's, we've always been youth led. We've always listened to young people's voice. So we're investing in giving young people the tools to make a change, and then we will use our networks and Rio's networks to amplify that voice on the 7th of December.
Yeah, definitely. It's a brilliant way to go about it. Okay, so one last one. The growth of women in football has been massive in the last 10 years. What do you think the key areas are to push to maintain this growth?
Well, from a selfish perspective, Chelsea winning the European Cup wouldn't be a bad start, would it? But let's park that one. On a serious note, I think, look, the growth of... Sorry?
Heartbreak, wasn't it? I mean, we were all absolutely buzzing for it, and then saw that half-time score. I thought, well, unless they're going to do what a Liverpool circa 2010, whatever it was, at half-time and get back to penalties, then yeah, not going to happen. But
as all good sports people know, there's always next year, right? So
yeah, and it was great to see from just like that women's sport perspective, the Roman Abramovich in the changing room with them after the game. Like, it really does show Chelsea are leading the way when it comes to the progression of the equality within that club. And I hope that the amount of media and the press and the positive feedback they've got over the last couple of weeks of what they've done with their team, hopefully can spur other teams on and other sports on to go, look, this is how well they're doing it. Let's catch up.
Yeah. So I think, look, the growth of the women's game has been huge over the last few years, and I think there's probably a number of reasons for that. There's been a movement to recognising women's sport and putting it on a more even keel from the media. And I think whether they've been forced into that by public opinion or whether it's a genuine commitment is probably a conversation for another day. I'm sure you might even have an opinion on that yourself.
Either way.
But I think that there's an increased sort of focus on women's sport now, which has put it in the spotlight. And I noticed just recently on a couple of occasions, we've seen, women's football in particular on the front page of newspapers rather than sort of on the 8th page in from the back of the sports pages. So automatically we're seeing a very, very big difference there. The sheer sort of volume of coverage, whether it is behind a paywall on Sky or whether it's the free to access stuff that we managed to get on BBC and what have you over the years, I think there is an increased recognition of women's sport and an increased value put on the game. I think that's there. I think there is more investment into the game coming on board, and that's at a club level. We've talked around sort of, Chelsea and of course Arsenal before invested a huge amount into the women's game and took it seriously, which raises standards. It means you get sort of the better quality overseas players there, which means that the games are a little bit stronger. We're getting the fan bases starting to turn up. So I think, from that perspective, without a doubt, there's been a media-led response to it. There's been a societal push around that equality and gender equality in particular that's led to it. And I also think that clubs are starting to recognise the value of it and starting to invest. My big question, and I don't know whether or not, and this isn't a scientific answer because I've not done the research, but just sort of an observational piece, is how far that trickles down into the grassroots game and opportunities for girls and young women to play and the facilities and the investment. I know it's a massive growth sport. Let's have it that way. It's a growth sport without a doubt. But when I go down and sort of see some of the local leagues that are happening, I don't see a huge amount of girls' underage leagues taking place. And if they are, the numbers involved in them tend to be a lot smaller than you would in the boys' game. So I guess, I think without a doubt there's been a growth. It's been fantastic at the highest level. I think women's football is probably more exposed and more in a good way. It's got more exposure is probably a better way of putting it. It's got more exposure and it's had far more investment than at any point. And I think that will only grow. I think the challenge is going to be, how do you then cascade that down so that we actually see real sort of strong grassroots movements and participation opportunities being driven at a local level, which may be a cultural shift. And on a global scale, we still have challenges that all relate back to the stuff that we talked about before, around sort of cultural challenges around the world. I don't think it's any accident that it's always the sort of, well, USA in particular, let's be honest, but the more developed sort of westernized countries tend to sort of win everything and qualify for the tournaments. And there are other countries around the world that I know of that have effectively just retired their women's teams and aren't putting them into their World Cup qualifiers. So
it's just a funding drain. But as soon as women's sport is actually seen as an opportunity rather than a drain on funds, then suddenly I think it will turn around. But it's like you say, that shift in perception.
Yeah, and it's always that big argument, isn't it? The argument has always been, well, if there was an audience and it put money on the gate and people were buying the shirts, then it would get a bigger platform and it'd get more media coverage and it'd get more sponsorship and investment. But if it's hidden and no one can see it, then how's it going to get how's it going to put the crowds on the gate? It's a challenge.
It kills me when you see, like you say, you've got the advertisement for a women's cup final on like the 8th page in from the back pages of the sports section, hidden away on a BT Sport +1 teletext, red button, whatever. And then you're like, oh, no one watched it. And it's like, well, why do you think no one watched it?
Yeah.
But then you put it on BBC Two. You see the England women's football team semi-final of the World Cup 2019. They put it prime time, BBC Two. We've got 12 million viewers. It was the most viewed TV show that year, more than Love Island Final, which I have to say is a pretty big one as well. And
I wouldn't be watching. I wouldn't be watching that.
No, really. I'll put you down for Love Island, mate.
No, definitely not me.
Well, it just shows that if you put it there, people watch it. And like when Kristen Press and Tobin Heath signed for Man United, 2 American female players signed for United this year, they broke the shirt sales record. And like that was for male or female shirts selling out in a couple of days, and shirt sales for female players have gone up 600% for Man United. And it's just like, if you do it well, there is actually an audience. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to say, oh, you're going to match it or it's going to be equal, but it'll be a hell of a lot bigger than what it is. And suddenly it will actually start earning you money. But yeah, it's that shift. And you got a team like the US female soccer team who are definitely leading the way, but that needs to be a global shift, definitely.
It's that visibility, isn't it? It goes back to the thing: if you can't see it, you can't be it. If it's on terrestrial TV, if you can build that movement, if it's accessible, if people are there, they see the atmosphere, then people will go. They want to go to games. As you say, if it's sort of being played at sort of on a Wednesday night, sort of on a red button kind of.
I have 16 HDMI cables to get it on, and 4 screens and 16 passwords.
Moving back from that, I suppose. Look, you've got to sort of celebrate the journey made so far in it, and I guess my sense is it's definitely women's football in particular. I'll be interested in what your thoughts are around women's rugby, but if you take women's football in particular,
we haven't got enough time.
It's got momentum behind it, hasn't it? Yeah, I just wondered where you sort of saw that with. Maybe that's a conversation. Maybe that's podcast part 2. Let's talk about.
Yeah. Oh, don't. That'd be a series in itself. But yeah, well, in short, the more rugby can follow in the footsteps of women's football, the better. I would say they're a brilliant blueprint for how to grow the women's game. And it would be great to see some of what they're doing. Like they've just got a deal for the WSL with Sky Sports next year, which is great, and the BBC. And I think the more that you see of that, the normalisation of women's sport will come in. We shouldn't be an exception to the rule anymore. It should be normal. When you've got a load of kids in a community and you're saying, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you've got girls saying, I want to be a footballer, rather than I want to be a nurse or a vet, which is obviously brilliant if you want to do that as well. But what the gender you're born with shouldn't determine whether or not you can become a professional athlete or not. It should be down to, are you good enough? And I think that's the more we can get, and programs like what you're building can instill that in young people, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about that. It's all about investing in the young people. It's investing at that community level. And if we get the grassroots right, I think everything else grows, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. If is there anything else you want to mention or cover?
No, I think you've exhausted my knowledge base, Flo. I think that's good. It's great. Thank you.
From a personal point of view, it's been so interesting because obviously, like, we talk to athletes a lot, and it's great to hear like athletes' opinion. But people who are actually in positions to create change, that's really interesting, because it's like, yeah, athletes can say what they want and they can affect the top level, but without that bottom level inclusion and progression, like, how will this ever infiltrate to the top level? You can't just have a brilliant national team and everything else will follow on. You've got to have that outreach programs, especially for in communities and cultures that probably can't do it themselves. You need that facility to be put in place.
It's about supporting and building, isn't it? And I think over the years, what we've seen is this sport for development rather than sport development, sport for development, which is kind of broadly the term they use these days. This idea of using sport to address social issues, I think it's grown into a movement. You know, it has grown into a movement, I think. So, you know, you've got global advocates for sport for change, sport for development around the world. You know, we have, you know, there are departments within the Commonwealth and the United Nations that are all about sport for development and peace. So, you know, it's become quite a global thing. And I think over the years, some of the programs that I've been involved with, because the UK were at the forefront of a lot of that development, we've influenced some of that approach, and hopefully we'll continue to do so. But you know, I think that for me, sport has just got such a unique place in culture. It's got such a unique place for young people. It's got such a unique place in the media that if we harness it in the right way, we can make some proper transformational change for young people, for communities, and especially those sort of, you know, those underprivileged, disadvantaged, working class communities. Those help people who haven't got a voice to find one. And then where somebody like the Rio Ferdinand Foundation comes on board, I think it's got a platform, a bit like the athletes we said before. It has a platform to be able to amplify that voice, and you know, it becomes that. I think that's where we want to get to, and that's what we're trying to do. And you know, Rio Ferdinand Foundation is just one part of that.
Yeah, and didn't you guys win the Laureus Sport for Good award?
That was Active Communities Network.
Active Communities, yeah.
That was in 2018. That award was won. So yeah, so again, well, Laureus would be a good case in point. You know, you've got people like Laureus Sport for Good Foundation that is all around the sport for development movement. You know, you've got organisations like Beyond Sport, whose role is to push that. But I think probably even more telling is the fact that agenda is now being embraced by the likes of UEFA, CONCACAF, FIFA, and also the United Nations, the Commonwealth, the World Health Organizations. All of those really, really big global influencers in sport and in policy and life, I guess, have now embraced this role that sport can play. And I think that's a significant shift in the last 10 years as well.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously I'm going to say this as an athlete, but I do just think sport is such a brilliant way to bring people together and remove barriers. It's like at the end, when you go on the field with your mates, you just care about the fact they're wearing the same jersey as you. Like, I couldn't care less where you're from, what your background is, what language you speak. And it's such a good way to, I think, to remove those barriers that society does struggle with. And there's just so many lessons that sport can teach wider society of how to treat people and how to just see people for what they have to bring to the table in terms of how they are as a person, rather than the situational circumstance they were born into. And I think, yeah, sport is the more people can take leverage from sport.
Yeah, and the key is to try and make sure that those lessons are taken on board and those attitudes continue when you come the other side of the white line and you're not on the field of play anymore, isn't it? Yeah. That's always the key. Sort of, how do we change that? How do we make that cultural shift in people's daily lives? Which comes back to the United Against Racism piece with the young people. It's around, you know, it's not about sort of making big grandiose statements around trying to sort of change institutional racism. Because if you're talking to a kid in Salford or Peckham, that can seem like a very, very long way off changing boardrooms and government. But actually making a change on the streets they walk in and the classroom they're in or the sports team they're with or the group they hang out with, that's achievable. And that's those sort of small steps that we need to get to.